Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the APAC AI user group. This is the August edition. As an introduction, my name is Sarath. I'm a data strategist and a cloud architect working for a company called BigQuery. The reason why we started this group is to help educate anybody who's new to the field of AI or who's already into the field of AI and wants to know a bit more information from different vendors, different solutions, and just to broaden people's knowledge. If you want to connect with us, we've got a number of different options for you. We've got a LinkedIn group. Obviously, sign up on a meetup group as well, and where we'll post new sessions that are upcoming. If you've got a session that you'd like to hear about, or you want to present at a session, please log it on GitHub at that link, and we'll get that facilitated for you. We are on Twitter as well, just using that handle. Okay. So the agenda for today is we'll take you through some brief news around the field of AI to show you what's happening, what's interesting, or what we found interesting. Then we'll pass it on to our speaker for his presentation, and then we'll take Q&A at the end of it. Just in terms of questions as well, if you've got any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them into chat and we'll raise them as we go along. Failing that, we'll get some of them asked at the end of the presentation as well. Okay. And with that, what I'll do is I'll introduce my co-presenter to you, who's Semi. She'll be taking you through the news today. Welcome, Semi.
Thanks, Sarah.
And I'll leave the news to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our news. It's going to be a great session, but before the main session, I'm going to have a couple of news to share with you guys regarding to the AI and ML world. The first one is regarding to Microsoft, one of the research projects in Microsoft, which is called Project Brainware, which is a deep learning platform for a real-time AI interface, which is cloud-based and on the edge. It uses the NPU, which is a natural processing unit, and it's run by it is based on the computer chip from Intel, and it's trying to integrate with the field programming gate, which they call it FPGA, to make a real-time AI calculation at the competitive cost and with industry low latency. So they wanted to, there are some cases that you need to make the decision in a real time, in the matter of seconds, to make sure that for example, if you're assessing a device or something, to assess and detect abnormality, you need to do it in a real-time fashion. So with this project or with this research project, you can make that calculation and you can make the decision in a real-time manner. So it will help a lot of quick decision during the process of assessing devices, and it will help to reduce and mitigate the risk and find out the faulty devices that are available. This project started like 2 or 3 years ago as one of the research projects within Microsoft, but nowadays they are starting to implement and use this project in their actual applications. The other thing that I want to share is recently there have been lots of talks regarding to GPT-3, and it is an NLP model which is developed by OpenAI. It is powered by GPT, and it will help user to build apps without needing to know how to write a computer code or formula. So the first product that they used to integrate GPT was Microsoft Power Apps, which is a low-code kind of platform that everyone can use. Whether you're with a non-technical or technical background, you can start building apps. And with this GPT integrated feature with it, you can start building your apps in a very humanized language. So you can start by saying what you want, and it will kind of generate and convert that to the actual command for you. It is one of the first implementation that shows how GPT works, and it is running on Microsoft Azure. And it is based on AI and ML. So it is the first in maybe internal uses, but there will be lots of other solutions that will be built based on this one. I'm going to post the links later on so you guys can have a look and read more about it. The other one that I want to talk about is the NLP. We've been talking about NLP to understand what humans says or do a lot. So there are lots of ML machine learnings which does that. But we oftenly talk about the actual sign languages. So NLP research often only focuses on the spoken languages and it excludes all like 200 sign languages around the world, which around maybe, I don't know, 70 million of people they are using as a way to communicate. So with an AI, we can use the pose estimation and we can use assess and understand what the sign language is. Initially, Google has developed a software that could understand the sign languages. They didn't make an app by it. They kind of make it open algorithm so other companies can start using these features. And they're hoping in future we can use this pattern or these algorithms to build lots of apps to understand or communicate using sign languages. This is something that will help our accessibility improve and grow a lot. So stay tuned. There will be a lot of more news around that coming as well. The last news that I want to share is regarding to Telestar AI Hack Day, not AI Day. Well, as some of you guys may know, Musk was one of the guys who was warning AI he was pessimistic around AI, and he was always mentioning that AI can be a danger to public and to the human. It will be bigger risk to the civilization. But for years, he was warning everybody around the cover, but now he seems to be taking matter to his own hand, and he's trying to go with the flow maybe. So recently, maybe a week ago, they announced that they are designing a Tesla bot, which is gonna help us to navigate through our daily lives, and it's gonna do the dangerous task or the simplest task that we can do. And it's going to be built based on the same chips and the sensor that Telestar car uses for the self-driving features car. And it's going to be based on, it was a bunch of presentation, PowerPoint slides, but there is a lot of behind the scenes. So they're going to use the intention is going to be it's friendly, but you can easily overrun or overpower it. So it's not going to be dangerous. They're going to build a Tesla bot, which is friendly and safe. This is the promise, so stay tuned with that one. It's gonna come soon as well. So the whole the intention behind was that the Musk said that the robot was not intended to help Tesla manufacturing, but because Tesla was doing a lot of IoT, they said why not build a robot, and that's how they plan to build a robot. So stay tuned with that one. The estimation is they're gonna maybe release this one next year to the market. So stay tuned with that one. I'm gonna share the link if you're interested in that one, you can read through it. And maybe I know there was a GIF around Tesla bots, but I couldn't find it. I wanted to put it up as well. Anyhow, this is for our news. I'm gonna pass it on to Sarat, and then we're gonna jump into the presentation.
Thank you, Sami. That was a very good set of news. I'd be interested to know what they're planning with that Tesla bot actually, and when and if it's going to release, and what sort of tasks they're expecting it to do.
Well, the list that they mentioned, it's gonna be like telling to do my grocery, or the extreme is to do some dangerous task. So they're taking like two extreme points. So I'm guessing they will start with the simple task and they will make their way to the dangerous part. But they said that all the articles that I read, they said it is something that you can easily overrun or overpower. So it's not going to be dangerous as his initial claims.
No, I just want something that'll clean my house for me so I don't have to.
I want that too. And cook maybe.
Yes. Well, cooking I can do. I don't want to do cleaning, but anyway. All right, what I'll do then is I'll introduce our speaker to you next. Our speaker's name is Kai Chishiro-Dennelly, and I'll just confirm with my speaker once he's online if that is how you spell his last name. Our speaker works for a company called Kasana, based out of Sydney. He's a software engineer that is looking at chatbots in particular, and I will leave it to him to introduce himself and go into it in a bit more detail. Sami, I'll just bring in our speaker for now.
Hi,
Kai, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Good evening. Like I said, welcome to our meter group. How do I actually pronounce your last name?
That was actually a really good one. That's it. It's Kai Chishiro-Dennelly. So you did very well, which is unusual. It usually trips most people up. So good work.
Good. Out of curiosity, because we were having this discussion, is it a Japanese name or is it?
Yes. So it's the first half is Japanese and the second half is English. So my parents had a very long route to getting married.
Okay. Perfect. Well, in terms of yourself then, so how did you get started in this field?
Sure. So I've pretty much worked in consultancies ever since I finished uni. So I've had a pretty good chance to have a crack at a lot of different things. It was a couple of years ago that you really saw cloud coming into the forefront. Everyone was migrating. It's kind of the new cool thing. And essentially, I just wanted to get involved with it. I started off with a lot of data projects, and then it really just sort of migrated into, well, if you can do that in cloud, then you can kind of do everything. So I pretty much ended up just doing whatever I could in GCP and AWS. And it sort of just led me that I really like chatbots. They're just something very humanistic. So kind of fell into it. I think how people often do in IT. So very lucky to be working in some cool stuff.
Nice. It's good. It's good. And you're right. It is a very interesting field to be in at the moment. I guess the next question I had for you in terms of this is how are you spending your time during lockdown now that Sydney-siders can't move that often?
I've decided to become a plant person. So I've sort of inherited a garden in the apartment that I'm in. So definitely becoming a lot more of a garden person and taking it a bit slow. So it's one thing that at least you can see change in your daily house. So definitely be spending a lot of time gardening these days, which is always, it's quite naturalistic, which is very nice.
Nice.
Being stuck in a house all the time.
Anything interesting that you're planting?
Lots of citrus. I love a good margarita, so started growing a bunch of lime trees.
Nice, very nice. I guess final question then before we get started with the presentation is how long have you been at Kasana?
Coming up to a year now. So started sort of in the middle of the first lockdown, I think it was around September last year. So almost coming up to a year. So great place to work.
Nice. Perfect. Very nice. Okay, what we'll do then is I'll hand over the presentation to you. It's all yours. Like I said, if there are any questions, I'll raise them on screen or I'll pop up on screen.
Cool.
So go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. So I guess I'll just throw up my slides to start. So I'm Kai. Obviously, I've worked at Kasana. I'm a senior engineer there, so get to spin up some cool stuff in the cloud. One of the big things that sort of entails is GCP as well as Dialogflow, which is an NLP product. So I thought we'd start off and chat about what that looks like in the industry and at least in sort of the public as a whole. And then also we'll sort of go into how to build one. It's much simpler than you expect. And then sort of how you can actually get some cool insights about how people interact with your chatbot and also how they interact with your business as a whole. So obviously I work for Kasana, but if there's any questions as I'm going, feel free to throw it into the chat and ask it along the way. So it's much easier to answer with a little bit of context. So feel free to stop me at any time and ask some good questions. Kick it off. So Dialogflow is an NLP product. So it's a complete SaaS solution. You don't have to do any infrastructure. You have to do very, very little actual training of your models that sit underneath. And essentially what Google have done, they've provided you a product that anyone can build a chatbot. I've just recently had a few trainees who have actually built their own chatbot and productionized it in their own little way. So it's a very easy product to pick up, and it's a very good abstraction of the difficulties of chatbots and NLP. And it essentially lets you focus on the really cool stuff of actual conversation design and actual UX. So how your customers and the people using these chatbots actually interact with it. And you can really focus on that experience and actually make it very holistic and tie it in with a lot more backend systems. So they actually make it essentially a default connectivity to all these different products. So obviously there's all your Facebooks, Twitters, pretty much anything. So these are already inbuilt one-click connectors. But as we kind of know, if you haven't touched GCP before, it's very API forward. So everything's an API, especially in Dialogflow. So you could hook this up to anything. So if you have a React front end that you just want to connect directly, that's also an option. So this is one of the brilliant things that Dialogflow does. It provides this super easy service that scales to global scale and lets you really focus on building something really interesting and really adds value to someone, whether that's your customers or internal staff. So it's a great product in that way. So I probably harp on it a little bit, but I can't really recommend it enough for NLP stuff, especially if you want to get something up and stood up in a very short time and show real good value. And I'll just go to the next slide. So we're going to look at a few sort of examples that we can see out in the public. This one's quite contextual. Right now, obviously, we're in the middle of COVID. Everyone's locked down. And one of the big things is vaccines. Everyone's trying to chase one. Everyone wants one. So this is actually one of the ones that Google has built to actually show for Vaughn's Pharmacy. Hey, people are coming to my business and they're asking a bunch of questions around COVID, whether I'm allowed to have a vaccine, whether I'm eligible. Hey, I actually want to book it. And essentially Google's provided this product. Hey, I can go to the business, click on the business chat, and I get to speak to a chatbot, which is brilliant in a way that it actually provides a lot of contextual evidence, especially around, hey, here's the website, here's how you can actually book your vaccine, but also stuff around, hey, where is the closest Vaughn's Pharmacy to me? So this is a really good example. And this is one of those ones that they show pretty much everywhere. So it's a great representation of some of the contextual information that you can give to customers. This one's probably a little bit more Australian based. So this one's Woolies. They have Olive the chatbot. This one's a little bit more niche in the fact that it talks just about SIM cards. It's about the delivery. I have a lot of questions around how can I get my SIM card? Where is my SIM card if I've ordered it? And how do I set it up? So this is a really specific niche product built in a way that is essentially targeting, hey, I just want to target this one business problem that people are calling my call center, and cutting off business that could be something else that's much more important. And that's something you'll see as a general trend in chatbots is we're not trying to remove people from the queue. We're trying to solve people's customers' problems without actually in the quickest way possible. So they don't have to sit there and wait for 5 minutes for a real person to ask, where's my closest store? So this is a really good example of that. A high volume traffic come in just about SIM cards. So it's really good just to have that covered. I'll send this through. It's got all the links to all the different chatbots. So they're all open. You can all go crazy on them. This one's a little bit one close to my heart in terms of interest. So who recently came out with Florence? So Florence is actually a digital health worker. So she was designed in a way to essentially help people to quit smoking. It was built just before COVID, and they've actually integrated a bunch of COVID information. So people have a very effective way to find COVID information from a chatbot, while also talking about in a very contextualized, hey, you're a smoker, this is what COVID means for you. So this is a brilliant product in terms of, obviously, it's a great organization to work for. But one of the really interesting things that they've done is leverage another product called Soul Machines, which essentially adds a skin to your chatbot. So obviously a chatbot and Dialogflow will manage to do all your conversational AI, manage the conversation state, manage all the different variables that run behind the scenes in the NLP. And the product, which is Soul Machines, actually just adds a really cool skin that is very humanistic. I'll show a quick example of it. But it's definitely something that I would recommend that people go play with because it's a very interesting technology. So I'll quickly just duck over to what Florence actually looks like.
Kai, I've got a quick question for you. With that skin that you were mentioning, does it work just with Google chatbots, or can it be used with any provider, so Microsoft and AWS?
Yeah, so is she still talking on your screen, by the way?
She is, but I don't hear any sounds.
Perfect. So Florence is actually, I'll have to mute her in a sec. So Florence is actually a brilliant product in terms of it actually works with any chatbot system behind the scenes. So it actually naturally ties in with Azure, AWS, Google, any of their products. Essentially, there's an inbuilt connector with it. Dialogflow just happens to be one of their favorite ones to work with from a product standpoint, which is very interesting because she's actually hosted out of AWS instances. So it's very interesting that they prefer Google Dialogflow as one of their provided NLPs, but it is an inbuilt connector. It's very difficult to get them to actually expose how it runs because it is proprietary. It's a startup actually in New Zealand, which is very interesting. But yes, she can connect to essentially all the NLP products that you can provide, but there is much tighter integration with Dialogflow than I would say with probably the other products. So it's a brilliant product to add a really interesting skin. She smiles, she nods, she does all the stuff, and it's all actually naturally inbuilt into their product. So I won't go too much into it because obviously I'll talk more about the NLP, but this kind of shows you what an end state chatbot could really look like in terms of once you've got the conversation down, you can obviously skin it in any way that you want. So whether that's a text, whether that's telephony, so you can call at the call center and you get someone. There's a myriad of ways, but it's all one conversation. So you can obviously talk to this and then suddenly go text who, and you'll get the same interaction, which is one of the really cool benefits of having a chatbot.
Perfect. Thank you.
Was there any other questions before I duck into sort of the last example?
No, keep going. That's the only question I had for now.
Cool. So an interesting chat is the architecture of how Dialogflow actually works. So Dialogflow itself is a standalone product. It's a SaaS, it scales. Very little interaction needs to happen to get it to work. The problem is it doesn't actually add brains to your conversation. So obviously you can do a question answer response and you do the NLP model and you will get a response and it's very static. But you find that doesn't add a lot of value to what your chatbot actually, how your customers actually want to use your chatbot. So a good example that we'll go through is, hey, what's the time? Unfortunately, Dialogflow will tell you that the intent that this person is asking for is the time, but it doesn't have the smarts to actually go out and procure the time for us. So this is why we actually have to create a backend system. In our case, it's I've provided Google products, which is very tight integration, but this can be hosted anywhere. So I can host it locally in the example that we'll go through. But essentially, you need to add some compute power to actually add some benefit to your chatbot. Obviously, Dialogflow will manage all your NLP, but without the smarts, it's just a dumb bot that can answer an FAQ. So as you can see, we obviously have to sandwich it between your front end and your back end resources. So obviously, if you have a CRM, that can be used. But again, you really do need this back end system that you're going to create. So it's typically a webhook. So we'll go through what that looks like and how to build that out. So let's start building. So essentially, we'll start off by skipping there. What we want to build, in our case, is going to be a chatbot that can tell the time. So that is a very simplistic idea, but what we want is a chatbot that can tell the time anywhere in the world. So Dialogflow can tell us that someone's asking about the time, but it can't actually fulfill that request. So we're going to quickly just click on what that might look like and how we actually go about designing and building this conversation. I guess we start off with what comes out of the box. So we get a welcome intent, which is obviously when I say hello to the chatbot, what are we going to get? And this is a really good example of what a basic intent would look like. In our case, we give it a name. We'll go through what context and events are, but essentially events is if someone opens Dialogflow, what's the first thing you want it to say? So I'll put that link there. In terms of the training phrases, so obviously if you're comfortable and you've seen NLP before, but the same as any NLP, you do and any sort of AI product, you do need to provide a training set. So in our case, it's provided for us, which is all the hellos. So all the different ways you could add hello. In our case, we can add more. So say if we wanted to make it slightly bilingual, we can add that in. So you can, and these can all be programmatically done via the API as well, if you prefer to do it that way. It's much easier to see actually inside of the UI, but you do have that option if you want to have a full CI/CD pipeline to do these kind of things. If we keep going, there's actions and parameters. These will pop up in the next section when we talk about what a dynamic intent might look like. And in terms of a static request, we can actually just have a text response. So, hi, I'm Timey. I can tell the time anywhere in the world. Just ask. And I can add to this and save it. I'll just keep it as is for now. But this is the interesting part. So if I save on the UI, you'll see it save obviously in the bottom right. But one of the really cool things that you'll see is it actually goes off and trains the model behind the scenes. I don't think I've changed anything, which was a little bit, it probably did it too fast to see. So often you'll see it saying it's training the model. So it usually takes a second or two to train the model underneath the hood, which is actually showing you that, hey, there's actually an underlying model. And it's actually utilizing what we add to the training set to actually create the model and actually build it out. And that essentially says, hey, I have a training set. I built out this intent. So an intent is essentially a question answer. So if we go to our example that we had, we can always test it out on this right-hand side and say, konnichiwa. And it should tell us hello. Oh, did I misspell it? So essentially, you need to add a lot of training phrases for it to essentially widen the search of things that you can get. And there is actually a query score. So it actually tells you how accurate and how confident it is actually in the score. So if we go into the actual response, there should be a score, a magnitude and a score, which is going through here. And then it says, hey, I'm very confident, and this is what the person's feeling. So there is a lot of raw information there, and you can actually add things to this to actually make it much more beneficial to the customer. Do you want to respond if someone's angry in a way? If you think that they're not really engaged, do you interact in a very different way? So that's how you do a default intent. Did anyone have any questions along the line while I'm talking, just about the default response and how that might work?
Nothing so far.
Cool. So let's go a little bit deeper into the email. And in our case, I'll show you what we're going to do. We want to get the time. So that seems like a pretty basic response in terms of, hey, I want to get the time. Let's essentially provide the time back to the customer. So in our case, let's have a look. So we have obviously our get time intent, and we're going to add some training phrases. So in my case, I want to be able to say, hey, what's the time in a country or a city? So in our case, obviously, I've added a training phrase, city and China. One of the important things to see here is we actually, Google lets you expand out your training phrase while also capturing the information given. And this is done by, before when we were talking about actions and parameters, we can say, hey, we expect the city and we expect the country, which is really important to us. So in our case, we're going to build out our training phrase, and you can actually select, hey, I think this should look like a country. So rather than just using a training phrase of a singular country, it actually expands out your training set to include all the countries that Google essentially recognizes, which is brilliant because it means that you can build quite a large training set very quickly without actually having to sit down and type out every country that you know of. So it's a very interesting and very cool way to essentially get something up and started very quickly. And you can actually add to these in different ways by using actually the entity mapping. So in, say, an odd case, you have a product map. So say if we were selling TVs, you could actually create an entity and say, hey, here's all the different brands of TV. That essentially will build out your training phrases to include all the sets of TVs that you've actually said. And it's also a really good way because it captures that information inside of the parameter. So we could, in our case, if we were to have a TV, it would have, hey, this parameter is called TV, and the entity is going to be TV types. The brilliant part of that is it actually gets saved by the conversation, and it can be reused later. So in the way that we're going to use it, we're going to need a backend to essentially process what city we're in and what the time is there. So in our case, that's why you see there's no response inside of the text response, because we're going to say, hey, I want my fulfillment to be done via the, just make sure my screen's full. Oh, there we go. I want the fulfillment of this intent to be done by a webhook. So a Dialogflow has done its base job. It said, hey, I recognize this conversation. I recognize what this person said. But what it says is, I don't have the capacity to fulfill this. So I'm going to need a webhook that you've built for me to tell me what time it is. Essentially, what they want is to abstract as much away of the actual compute, away from Dialogflow itself, and into a webhook that you design and you control. So essentially, Dialogflow, it's just for NLP. Don't try and add too many smarts into it. It's good for its one job. So let's go into the fulfillment. If anyone had any questions, feel free. But fulfillment is essentially, we're saying, in our case, we're saying, well, if someone's asked for fulfillment, let's send it off to this endpoint. So in my case, I'm hosting a local endpoint of a Python Flask server, where I've essentially spun up a Flask server saying, hey, I want to service these requests. In our case, it's going to be stuff coming in from Dialogflow. And as part of that, obviously, they'll send a bunch of information. It'll be all the information that we saw before when the intent was getting matched. So it'll be stuff like, hey, this person wants the time. Hey, they're asking about this country or this city. So with all this information, obviously, all programmers, we can all probably formulate some solution in Flask to actually respond to that. And that's what we've done. So in our case, we've obviously created a webhook in Flask and saying, hey, here's my endpoint. Please return to me. There's a little bit of smarts in terms of, I've obviously got a function map. The function map is saying, hey, get me the time and call this function for me. So obviously, every time that we call this backend, it's actually saying, hey, here's my request. I'm sending my request off to this backend. We're doing a little bit of smarts to say, hey, this looks like the intent. Let's call this function. So in our case, we get the time. So if we go to the definition, obviously I do a little bit of smarts and I do, hey, call this API, get me the time, get me this. But essentially, it's all coming in from the request itself. So inside of this JSON object that's getting sent, we get all the information required to actually fulfill the intent itself. We get the city or the country, you can actually ask either or. And it actually goes, okay, well, let's go off and find if it's a country or if it's a city, sorry, let's go get the weather and the time for that city. So these are all functions that I've written. You could do it anyway. The really easy part of this is all we have to pass back as a function is actually a fulfillment text. So a straight up string of, here's the information that I want you to print back to the screen. So in our case, I've obviously had, hey, in this, and this, would you like me to email that to you? So in our case, you can see that obviously I'm doing a little bit of filling in terms of dynamic content. So I want the city, I want some time, I want it to be formatted like this, and I want the weather. But it's just returning a string. So this string could be anything. And you can do any smarts that you want to essentially feed back to your chatbot. But all you have to do is send back an object that is fulfillment text is equal to a string. So this lets you do some really cool stuff around, hey, I want to call these APIs. I want to interact with backend systems. I want to create buttons, that kind of stuff. I might even want HTML. And this is what the smarts of the actual chatbot come in. So we've obviously left all the Dialogflow to manage all our NLP. And it does really, really well in saying, hey, I'm not good at actually fulfilling the request. I don't have the compute. Let's send it off to the backend to actually tell us what this compute will be. So if I go back to our example and go to Timey, so obviously I've said hello to it. I can say hello again. So this is just a default web view that they actually give you. So say if we said, hey, I'm Timey, I want to ask what time it is in the world. Let's follow what this conversation actually looks like through the different tools and actually see how it works. So let's say, what is the time in Brisbane? Hopefully this should be all hooked up. Cool. So in Brisbane, it's 6:04 p.m. and it's 17 degrees with clear sky. So obviously, let's start off with Dialogflow, which has to do the NLP. So I can actually go to the history and actually have a look at this conversation. I'll just have to find where it is. Load the page quickly. Oh, here we go. So it was already there. So if you have a look, we can actually see the conversation log happening. Obviously, I said hello before, and then I've asked what time it is in Brisbane. We can actually have a look at all the different stuff that happens. So we can have a look at the raw log of things that have happened, which is a brilliant way if you want to actually store data and see what's happening at a holistic level. In our case, I'll show you what the code does, because it actually does its own logging, which is really interesting. So obviously, what's the time in Brisbane? And if we go to the raw intent, so let's have a look at the intent that it got to. It got the get time intent. So this is exactly what we're saying. The NLP of Dialogflow has said, this person has said this, and I've matched it to this intent. So obviously, it comes in, it says, okay, it must be a city. What's the time in Sydney? So it's obviously built it out as what's the time in Brisbane. And again, this is NLP, so it can be very, very fuzzy in terms of how it actually matches, which is brilliant for us. So you can ask it in any which way, what's the time in a certain city, and it should still work. And it's recognized that and said, hey, I know this is the intent, but I can't fulfill it. So it then sends this off to the webhook. So if we go to the fulfillment, goes to this address, which is, in our case, I've had to host a HTTPS because obviously Dialogflow, it says you have to have a HTTPS endpoint for security reasons. So I've hosted a HTTPS endpoint using ngrok. If you're not comfortable with that, that's just essentially saying, take my address, host me an address, and point it at this port locally, which is a very easy way to do local development. And as you can see, I'm not sure if that's too small there, but you can see that a request has come in and it's saying, hey, I want to get the time, and it's in Brisbane. So as you can see, it's actually giving us the city. So in the case, I can find that print statement. It should be somewhere here. I can't. Oh, here we go. So get the weather in the city. So as you can see, we've actually gone in, it's recognized the intent, and it's calling this function. So in our case, it's get weather, which is actually getting if it's a city. So as you can see, it's obviously said, hey, go do my smarts, go call the API endpoints and all that sort of stuff, get me the time, and please send that back. So that's how we've ended up with the conversation that looks essentially like, hi, what's the time, with a return. So it's pretty straightforward in that way to build, obviously, a fulfilled dynamic intent, which is a really good way of actually saying, hey, this is actually how you get really good conversations out of a chatbot that are informed, they have context from backend systems. This is what you want out of a chatbot. You don't want something that simply you could have Googled an answer for. I guess it's important to note, so obviously we're going to go a little bit into the data side of things in terms of, hey, well, how do I actually turn these conversations that my chatbot's now fulfilling? Well, how do I monitor it? Obviously, we all know that AI can definitely go off the rails very quickly. So it's very important for us to have some way of monitoring, some way of actually interacting, and actually even in a way of being able to intervene if something goes terribly wrong, which is the case which can always happen with NLP when you give it a lot of power, a lot of responsibility for us to actually monitor it and actually keep across what's actually happening behind the scenes. So in our case, I've actually done a log to BigQuery. So BigQuery, I'm not sure how many of you are comfortable with that, but it's essentially just a big database. I've spun it up for my monitoring needs, but I've actually had a log request function that I just throw into the end of my function to say, hey, you've taken this intent and you've fulfilled it. Let's make sure we're logging this information. So if I haven't actually opened the BigQuery, but I've actually saved it there. And essentially from there, you can have business insights around, hey, these are the kind of people that are chatting with my chatbot. This is how many interactions it's having. And from there, you can also run sentiment analysis. So obviously Dialogflow actually provides a lot of sentiment analysis in terms of, hey, we think they're angry. This is how strongly they feel about it. But obviously, being AI people, we always want to know more. So being able to store all that data for you, you can run your own models. And from there, you could even feed that back into the chatbot. So obviously, if you find that a certain intent is just not having the same impact that you want from them, you can obviously go back, interact with it, and actually make it work and say, hey, we're going to change the conversation and how it flows, just because people don't seem to be using it the right way, or people are talking to it differently, which is a really important note to have that people will use chatbots very differently to how they use traditional means. So if you're talking to a person, there's a lot more context. There's a lot more information you expect out of the person. And the conversation needs to be very different. So I think we'll jump back onto the last part of building a chatbot, which will be essentially how do you build conversation flows? So obviously in the example that I asked for the time, there's only really one response and that's it. There's not a lot of contextual information from the previous question that I might have asked. So that's why with this example, at least, I've added an example of saying, well, would you like me to email that to you? So obviously you can see that there's a contextual link between what's the time in Brisbane and what the person will say next. So let's just go through the conversation, and that's a good way of sort of seeing what the outcome is. And then we'll sort of work backwards and actually show you how that works. So let's say with this person, what's the time in Brisbane? Would you like me to email that? Let's say yes, please. It asks for my email address. Let's put in my email address. Great. So that sent me off all my information that I've just had in an email. So as you can see, with this conversation, it's really important to notice that, hey, this contextual first question is obviously by itself, but this yes, please is in context to the question that the chatbot's asked. So obviously, if the person was to say yes, please randomly out of the blue, there doesn't make so much sense to respond with, great, can I get your email? So there's a very contextual link between what the Dialogflow has said and the response that the person's giving. So this is how a conversation works. I'm sure most of you know how a conversation works, but in terms of actually building that in Dialogflow, there's a concept of inside of each intent, you'll see there's actually a context. So contexts are really important for two reasons. The first one being, obviously, conversations need context. So if I say yes, please, depending on the context, that means very different things. If I've just asked, hey, can you jump into the pool? And I say, yes, please, it doesn't really make so much sense. But if I've just said, hey, would you like a hot dog? Yes, please makes a lot more sense. So context is how you actually daisy chain conversations and intents together to actually form a very meaningful conversation. So in our case, we'll quickly go through what that looks like and why we can get from get time down to, hey, can you send me an email about it? So if we have a look, as we get time, we've added two contexts to this. So there's two kinds of context. There's input and output. To daisy chain them together, your output context of the previous intent matched needs to be the input context of the next intent that you want to follow it. So this will make a little bit more sense straight at the start. So let's quickly go to, so this is get time. So this is, hey, what's the time in Beijing, for an example? As you can see, we have the get time follow-up, which is just, we create this to say, hey, for the next intent, we want it to have the input of being the follow-up to this one. And we also want to have an extra custom one that we've written, which is just email. So we can add whatever we like, and it will add a context for us. So this is how you can actually create branches and tree, almost like a tree-like structure of how a conversation might look like. Because obviously, there's not one answer or one way to respond. So there's obviously going to be a yes or a no, and there's different ways that conversations can flow, and that's how context control that. Another thing to note is there's obviously a lifespan. It's typical best practice to keep these at 1 because suddenly context, if it lives for longer, can get very confusing. So let's have a look at this one. So obviously we have an output context of a follow-up and an email context. So if we go back and we have a look at the next one that we've created a yes. So in our case, I've used the training set that's provided for yes, which is brilliant. They give you a bunch of pages of how people might say yes, which is very easy to build a chatbot that way. And in our case, you can see that the context is actually get time follow-up, and it's also email. So what that means is Dialogflow knows when someone has said, hey, what's the time? And the chatbot has obviously said, hey, would you like that as an email? It's expecting us to actually go to this intent. It's saying, hey, Well, if any of these training phrases are available, then this is a available contextual intent that can be selected. So this is really good because it means that, hey, we can suddenly make daisy chaining conversation happen. So if we have a look, this is for the yes. And obviously with our yes, we're going to ask, hey, what's the email address? If I go back and have a look at the no, it'll look incredibly similar. So if we have a look here, it's actually got just this one. The reason why we have the email one, and this will come into a little bit more context a little bit later, is these parameters. So if I go back to email, the get time. So inside of get time, we obviously have something called a parameter. So a parameter was the GeoCity, could be the country you're asking about, and this is actually getting saved inside of this parameter. But it's very important to state that parameters are actually stored inside of the context. So that's why we've included our own custom context of email to hold our information in, to say, hey, well, I want to store this information. So I'll quickly show what that looks like in part of the logging, which will make it a little bit more clear. So let's say, can you tell me the time?
Hi, quick question for you. When you're building this chatbot out, obviously you've got to set it up with some language and some key terms. Is there a way to import that from the dictionary somewhere? Have you tried that?
Yes, so you can actually write your own load script. So I guess the best way of explaining it is all of this is actually JSON. So this is all config, essentially. So you can actually export your whole chatbot as a zip file and unzip it, and it actually just comes out as a bunch of JSON files. So an easy way of logging it is obviously you can write your own custom script to say, hey, scrape everything from this website and throw it into a dictionary straight into your training set. So it is very easy to auto train it. That does come with the caveat of buyer be warned in terms of obviously you've given a lot of power and a lot of scripting in autopilot. Again, yes, it's definitely doable. So that can actually be part of your CI/CD pipeline. If you do create something that's like, hey, every time that I want to deploy my bot, can you please just check my training phrases? Can you check the accuracy against, say, a really default set of conversations that you might have?
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Great. So if I ask what time in Tokyo, we'll quickly see once it comes back that inside of this diagnostic info, this looks like a lot, I know. But if we have a look, we can actually see the output contexts. And inside of these output contexts, we actually store this parameter. So in our case, we're storing the GeoCity to be Tokyo. And obviously, we're going to do a bunch of interactions with, hey, what's Tokyo inside of our webhook to say, hey, go look up Tokyo for me. So that's how you store critical information and contextual information to the conversation as it passes. Because obviously, with context, it's very important. Certain conversations, it's very different to say one thing. If you say, my name is Kai, obviously you want the bot to know my name is Kai for the rest of the conversation. So you can have obviously an intent and then a parameter that stores my name is Kai for the entirety of my conversation. So this is how you can essentially branch contextual information throughout your whole chatbot conversation. So in our case, we're passing that in. And that's why in our case, we want to have an email. Because in our case, we're going to say, hey, I want to know what my email is. Obviously, I can't email you without your email. So when they say yes, we pass this email output context. And we say, hey, what's your email? And as you'll see, when we go to the email intent, in my case, I've just added one training phrase, which is email, which is essentially just saying, hey, can you just get me the training set that Google provides for all the training phrases for emails, which essentially lets us build out a huge data set very quickly. Again, it's important to test this stuff out with multiple different kinds of emails. If you're expecting certain regex, that kind of stuff, you can always add that in. But it's very easy to build, obviously, a very quick chatbot by using these pre-built training phrases. And in our case, you can see that this same context is actually getting passed in. And that's actually where this email is getting written to. So as you can see, we've got this sys email getting written to email. And in our case, we're calling the webhook. So it doesn't even call this response. So this is the default if everything goes wrong. But we go to our webhook for this. And this will make a little bit more sense. So if we have a look, we obviously have an email context with an email variable inside of it. So if we actually go to our backend and we have a look at what this might look like, as you can see, inside of the query results, we actually get the email from there, from the actual parameters themselves coming into the actual conversation, which lets us get our parameter for the email and actually lets us send it off to the people. So that's essentially how contextual information gets passed between your actual Dialogflow and your backend, which can obviously do a lot more complex conversations and a lot more interactions. So that's essentially how you build a chatbot from scratch. That has the NLP of the Dialogflow to actually cover all the conversation. And then your backend, which obviously you can host anywhere and you can host in any language pretty much. I think it's pretty much the main ones you will see is Python and Node. But again, there's a lot of options there to host that, and you can write it in pretty much any language. I guess I'll finish off with actually showing you the integrations that come inbuilt in it, which is sort of the more interesting ones that we saw from the start. And then we'll go a little bit about how there's an auto training and that kind of stuff. So we have our Telephony Services, which is if someone calls your call center, you want them to talk to a chatbot. So it's really important to note that this actually comes pre-built as a conversational bot too. So you can hook up a conversation gateway. So you can say you're on Twilio and people are calling your call center. You can hook in a chatbot, the same chatbot that essentially talks to people via text into the same conversation through actual conversation. So there's a few telephony services and there's a bunch of text-based ones. So these are all actually one click, which is brilliant. This is one that I've done before. It's very easy to obviously just throw in your token. It's a 4-step process to get you essentially up and running on Facebook. And it's the same chatbot that talks across all of them. So that's how you integrate it with your front-end systems. I guess I'll finish it off with probably the slightly more AI kind of stuff. So Dialogflow actually provides you by actually letting you train it as you go. And it actually points, so if we have a look, say if people have been having conversations with your chatbot and Dialogflow thinks that there's been an issue, it actually lets you reassign intents, which essentially just adds these people's training phrases to the training phrases, these person's conversations to the training phrases of the intent that they were trying to match. So let's say if this person said, okay, they said this and we don't think it should have been in this intent, it actually lets you not confirm it and delete it. So it's a good way to actually get your bot up and running if people are interacting with it. Obviously, there's it's a live object in many ways. As people interact with it, it will improve. So that's one way of doing it. You can obviously do it externally inside of your own NLP stuff, but that's definitely the inbuilt feature of it. And I guess we kind of go to the last one, which is validation. So they actually provide you with some really good feedback about your chatbot as you're building it. Personally, I'm not a huge AI person in terms of knowledge base. So this is brilliant because it lets you say some really basic mistakes that you might do when you're building a chatbot. So in this case, let's have a look. It says, hey, there's not enough training phrases for this intent. So there must be some threshold that they have recommended to say, hey, this training phrase isn't enough. You don't have enough training phrases for this intent for it to be wide enough scope to actually work properly. So that's definitely an issue. And as you can see, in my case, I've built it very quickly. So there's obviously a lot of productionized issues. You often find the not enough unique training phrases is quite good because obviously building it quickly, you can only really think of 10 different ways of saying things, whereas people say things in thousands of different ways to mean the same thing. So as you can see, there's actually a bunch of other issues. So this is one of the really good things that they provide is instant feedback as you're building the chatbot of sort of what they recommend as best practice. Which hopefully by the end of it, you'll be able to see as your chatbot improves, you'll see, hey, this is how people are using it. This is how many sessions I'm having. And you can really deep dive into it. So obviously you have sentiment. So you can see, are people happy with my chatbot? Are people interacting with it in the way that I think they're interacting with it? So I think that's pretty much it that I had in terms of how to build the chatbot in Dialogflow. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. I can't seem to see any in the chat, so Sarath?
No, nothing in the chat, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's
But
all
I had a
good.
couple of questions for you, though.
Yeah, please.
If people want to get started with creating chatbots in Google, what
Yep.
is the best resource for them to start? How can they start?
The documentation is brilliant. So Dialogflow was really built to be essentially very starter friendly. All their documentation is brilliant. So if you start from the homepage, the getting started guide is awesome. It does come with the caveat that you do need to be on GCP. It is directly tied with a GCP project. But obviously, as with most GCP products, there's a huge free tier. So if you do want to get started, essentially go straight to the documentation and run through it, because it does kick you off from scratch and essentially builds a chatbot for you in 10 minutes, I think it is.
Okay. So if people are running it, so are you running it on the free tier, or is your the demo that you're running hosted?
Yes.
And it's free?
So mine's actually on the free tier. So at the moment, you probably saw that my backend was locally hosted. Even if I was to host that on, so they do actually offer a hosting service for your backend service if you want to do it via Cloud Functions, which is serverless compute. But even that, it's all based off your volume. So unless suddenly your chatbot becomes the most popular one in Australia overnight, it's very hard to hit that free tier. I think it's something like 5,000 calls. So unless when you're building the chatbot, you've somehow gained huge popularity, it's very hard to get over that free tier. So definitely getting started is definitely go to the documentation, spin up GCP resource, and start going crazy. Essentially, you get $500 free credits, I still believe, when you first sign up. So if you haven't even touched GCP before, they give you a huge allowance in the first year just to give it a try.
Okay. No, definitely sounds good. If you can share some of the links that you've shown during the meetup, that'll be great.
Sure.
So we can post them as well.
Yeah, that's sure. I can. I'll throw in the whole slideshow. So the slideshow has all the links to the different ones, and I'll throw in a few more links around Dialogflow and some documentation.
Okay. If people are interested in the slideshow, just reach out to one of us. We can share it with you. Alternatively, we'll find a place to host them, either on Meetup or somewhere on like SlideShare. But leave that with us. We'll try and get something organized for that. Okay.
Awesome.
I don't think there are any more questions, are there, Sami, in the chat window? No. Okay. All right. In that case, thank you very much, Kai, for coming tonight and spending your time presenting. It's definitely been a very useful presentation for me, both in terms of understanding what Google offers in terms of chatbots and what are some of the solutions that you can build.
Yep.
I also found it interesting looking at Florence to see what has been achieved using this technology. And I'm looking forward to replicating something like that at my company so we can actually become popular quickly.
It's a growing theme that I'm seeing a lot more people trying to pick up Soul Machine. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see it more often around.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a very cool product. It is definitely is. The ability to chat in real time, either via text or voice, is a great feature to have. Definitely.
It definitely opens up the floor to a lot more meaningful conversations.
Cool. We've got a couple of comments from chat, basically saying it's a very good presentation.
Oh, thank you. So
yes, and it definitely is. It's been very useful for me and eye-opening as to what's happening.
Dialogflow is a great product for people, especially like me, who I'm never going to say I'm great at AI, but it lets me build a really cool AI product without a whole lot of understanding of the really nitty-gritty stuff. So,
yeah. Out of curiosity, have you built an AI chatbot for your company as well, for Kasana, to handle requests that are coming in?
No, so we don't really have a chat channel, to be honest. So obviously we're a consultancy, so we work with businesses. So it's pretty rare to get people actually coming to have a conversation with us. But we did actually have a chat about the next hackathon. We were thinking we might actually build one, just a basic FAQ, and maybe does a few stuff around taking names and that kind of stuff as a next hackathon project. But again, that could be a great idea. So I'll definitely try and push it onto my boss that it's a good thing to build out.
Yeah, because I was thinking along the same lines as whether we hold something like a hackathon to write chatbots or any other AI solutions for that matter.
Yeah, from a time frame perspective, it's awesome. You can easily stand up a chatbot within a day.
And I guess the last question then is, how do you productionize a chatbot? So obviously you've shown us how you can develop it.
Sure. So I guess the first part is Dialogflow is a SaaS, so there's no hosting issues. So there's no infrastructure. It will scale up to pretty much Google level scale. So again, that's one of the brilliant parts of having a managed service. I don't have to think about the underlying infrastructure. Do I have enough compute? Do I have enough memory? It will scale up and it will run to any scale. So that's the NLP part done. In terms of the backend, so obviously your webhook will have to scale to manage that many requests. So it's typically done, we typically do it as a containerized application for the webhook. And then we can run that in Cloud Run, which is, again, it's serverless compute, which means essentially it should scale to infinite scale. So I'd say this quite often when we develop at Google scale. So if you do containerize your backend, which is very, very straightforward, and you run it on Cloud Run, again, it'll run to whatever scale you need. So that's essentially how you can get production grade SLA from all your products. So very, very easy to productionize, which is nice.
Is it running on a GKE cluster at the back end?
They don't reveal that in terms of, but I would be very surprised if it didn't.
Right.
They're very Kubernetes first for everything, and Dialogflow was built by them. So my assumption would be it would be GK under the hood for both the products.
But you as a developer don't have any exposure to GKE when you're trying to deploy this. Okay.
Yes. So that's one of the brilliant parts of having it as a fully managed service is I don't have to even think about what's underneath. It should just run up to infinite scale.
All right. Perfect. No, that's good to know. That's very good to know. Again, thank you very much for taking the time to present this user group.
For having me.
And I hope everybody who's attended has found something useful that they can take out of it. Yes, please feel free to go ahead, log into Google, try your own solutions. If you find something interesting or you make it the next big thing and you are making, it's a major solution to have around the world, come back and present to us, and that'll be much appreciated. Okay. So with that, just go a few housekeeping stuff before we finish off the presentation for tonight. The next event will be in September. Last week of September typically is when at the end of every month is when we typically run these events. The topic and the guest speaker has not been confirmed just yet. But if you would like to present at this event, go ahead and submit your session. Alternatively, if you want to hear about a topic, let us know on there as well, and we'll get to it as soon as we can. Okay, we do have a YouTube channel where most of our recordings will go. So if you want to have a look at our previous events, please feel free to go there and have a look. There are some very good conversations that we had previously, everything from knitting to medicine. Okay. We would appreciate any and all feedback about this user group, how we are running, what you would like to see improved, what you'd like to keep. And your feedback is very important in deciding what we do going forward. And with that, big thank you to everybody who attended our meeting. Again, to Kai, to all our members, and to my fellow organizers as well, who actually helped me set it up and basically get the material ready. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good night.